Everybody, welcome to this newsroom Friday live stream. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist. This topic for today is prompted by years of students in the programs I teach in asking me, how do we explain what we learn to the public? How do we share the knowledge that we're getting in our education with people who don't have our background? So I'm going to speak to that a little bit. Q&A, let's do that. Anytime you've got a question, just go ahead and type it in, and I'll keep an eye on the chat space there. Wanted to mention too that if you like these Friday free live streams, you can just sign up, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I post something at the beginning of the week to let people know on Friday I'm going to be presenting this topic or that topic or what have you, so you can keep up with me that way. And also, I have a monthly events newsletter, and if you go to chalquist.com, mylastname.com, you can sign up for that too. I won't spam you. It's just stuff I'm up to and trying to move forward the work that I'm doing, so you can hear about that there. So how to translate the deep stuff into terms people can understand. Let's talk about that. Some context to begin with. So what do we mean by deep? Little anecdote. When I was a graduate student, James Hillman, the archetypal psychologist, would sometimes come to school and he would sit with the students. And when I met him, I was already starting to work on my dissertation, which had to do with tracing the presence of the lands that we live in, work in, places, not only the landscape itself, but even houses, roadways, stuff like that. How do they show up inside of us in the psyche? So Hillman would come in and he'd sit with us and he'd say, "What is depth?" And then he would leave it up to us to answer. And one of his reasons for doing it that way was to break us out of thinking that only he was the expert on this and we had to look to him for all the answers. So eventually he would give an opinion, but first he would ask us. And so there's the question for you: what is depth? And if you want to put your thought in the chat, that's great. I'll keep an eye on it. But I'll go ahead and answer since I want to keep this live stream to a reasonable size. Hillman worked in the context of depth psychology, which has to do with the study of how the conscious mind and the unconscious interact with each other. And so depth for him meant what's going on under the surface, what's going on under events, under the symptoms, under conflicts, under our conscious thoughts, that kind of thing. And so one way to get at that is to look inside of symptoms and events for the images that resonate inside them to get a sense of underlying dynamics. So an example would be, right now there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence and how clever it now is, and that's a conversation that's going to keep going. It's been going for a while, actually. But if you've read into folklore and traditional stories at all, you might be thinking about figures like, I'm thinking of ancient Jewish stories about the golem, about an artificial being that powerful magical rabbis would animate to carry out their precise instructions. Today we would call this an algorithm. And so AI as a folkloric entity has a very long history. And when we study that history, we learn a little bit about the psychology that goes into the whole context of the discussion, but usually at an unconscious level. Are we ready to awaken the golem? And have we learned from the old stories that tell us that when you give a robotic, as we would now call it, or an artificial intelligence instructions, are we imaginative enough to understand that they will carry out those instructions to the precise letter? So that's a quick example of depth. Another might be to just look at a symptom and ask, is there some message here? Is there something that we are unconsciously trying to tell ourselves. So Hillman was kind of moving in that direction when he was talking about depth. But in terms of this discussion, although that's part of it, some of the things that we learn when we are seekers have to do also with consciousness studies, deep ecology, cosmology, um, how to work with dreams, why mythology has some wisdom in it, contemplative practices, esoteric traditions, things like that, spiritual studies. When you learn that and you're facing the task of somehow explaining that to somebody, it can be daunting. So I have a few suggestions in a moment about how to go about that. So one thing that keeps coming up in these discussions is that we're trying in a way to convey wisdom. So we should talk just briefly about what that is. No comprehensive definition. I don't think wisdom can be nailed down, but we can come at it through tentative definitions and also, again, some folkloric inspiration. So if you go to the dictionary, like Merriam-Webster's, let's say, you'll find that wisdom is often defined as insight, judgment, knowledge, and then all of a sudden the definition becomes circular. So it says wisdom is to have a wise attitude, belief, or course of action. So you look up wise, and it says basically to act with wisdom. No help there. So I think we can go a little bit further if we look at the word mentor, and that's part of what we're talking about today. How to mentor people in what we've learned, whether that's actual teaching or more informal kinds of mentoring, like just during a conversation with a friend, let's say, or a family member. So the word mentor itself has a rich history, and it refers to a character in the Odyssey, in Homer's Odyssey. It's one of the faces worn by the wisdom goddess Athena. And she is a teacher to many different people in Greek folklore and history. Of course, Athens is named after her, but in the Odyssey, she takes a particular interest not only in Odysseus, but also in his young son Telemachus, who needs wisdom. He's on a journey of seeking not only his father, but ultimately himself. And what better guide could you possibly have than Athena? So, wisdom could be taken as some sort of conscious relationship to what Athena and her sisters and other pantheons are, what they represent, what they personify. And she's got a lot of sisters. Thinking of White Buffalo Calf Woman, um, Sky Woman, both in American Indian folklore, Saraswati, um, lots of different sisters. And one thing to bear in mind here is that when you look through a lot of mythology and folklore, you find that wisdom is pretty much always feminine. It's interesting. And when there's characters who are masculine or even non-gendered who are described as wisdom characters, usually they learned it from one of these feminine wisdom figures. Prometheus is a good example. The trickster who learned his technical prowess from Athena, actually. So, right relations, conscious relations with the entity of depth and knowledge might be one way of talking about wisdom. Knowledge below the surface, foreseeing complexities and consequences, that's a characteristic of wisdom. Brings to mind another mythic figure, Cassandra, who is the one who warns the Greeks about the Trojan horse, and everybody ignores her. She's cursed to have accurate knowledge of the future but be ignored. So that's an unpleasant position to be in terms of wisdom. There's a deeper story there, but we won't go into it. So wisdom could also refer to the ability to take up some sort of a thoughtful, reflective stance toward inner presences, dream figures, fantasy figures, imagination, and also outer events. That's another aspect. And for me, wisdom includes qualities like patience, emotional self regulation, compassion, knowledge, and self trust, all of which are good qualities to have when you're mentoring people. So, this brings us directly to the difficulty of translating deep learnings into terms other people can understand. And I'm using that word translating on purpose because I think that's the key. This is really an issue of being able to translate what you know into terms other people can understand. So my suggestions will hover around that basic dynamic of translating. So one thing it's helpful to have is a suite of basic mentoring skills. So in addition to the qualities that I've mentioned, here's a couple. Let's unpack this a little bit. So to be able to listen actively instead of simply talking, and particularly when you're mentoring somebody one-on-one or you're mentoring a group, there's this strange thing about, I'm trying to think of it, if it's always been true of American culture, states specifically, but we seem to be addicted to endless talk. And I've noticed this especially with people who've had a lot of therapy. Not always, but a number of times I've run into people or I've seen them online who think that teaching or mentoring is largely a matter of talking, and it's not. If anything, the listening part is equally important, and sometimes it's more important. So I'm thinking of a friend of mine who is a great active listener, Linda, and she's so wonderful at it that sometimes if I'm trying to figure out a dream I have, and I call up Linda and say, "Do you have a few minutes? I got a weird dream I'm trying to figure out." And so there's something about her presence and the quality of her listening that oftentimes halfway through my description of the dream, I get it. Now that's good mentoring, right? So being able to listen and not just talk, right? Another basic mentoring skill is, and this one depends on your imagination, being able to see the potential in people that you're mentoring. And that's different from having an agenda for them. It's actually understanding them well enough, partly through active listening, that you can see some of the possibilities that they can actualize in their lives. So that's an important quality. And then once you see them, you can encourage the people to move toward them. Being able to be non-judgmental is important. To be able to suspend judgment while you're with somebody you're mentoring, that's very important for lots of reasons. Safety being an obvious one, emotional safety for them, right? And then empathy. So being able to put yourself in their place and ask yourself, what would be useful for me to hear right now if I were them? And again, this depends on imagination. Empathy is sometimes described as this kind of soft, squishy capacity that lets you, oh, I see why you feel that way and all that. That's a very shallow kind of empathy. Empathy, as I understand it, is a deeper imaginative grasping of exactly what it is people need at that moment. And sometimes you can't express it consciously to yourself, but you feel it in other people anyway. So, in terms of looking at a public, an audience of some kind, this is often described these days as being able to read a room, and which, by the way, is another reason for cultivating active listening, even while you're presenting. Because if you're only talking, if you're absorbed with what you're saying, too absorbed, then you lose what's happening around you. and people might be going or whatever, or falling asleep, or and you don't you're so focused on what you're saying you don't know. So empathy is important. The ability to encourage people is important. um, Not superficial positive, you can do anything, because that's nonsense. No one can do anything. But to intelligently encourage people, well, I think you'd be really good at this. This is something you could do well. Um, Being able to celebrate people going beyond what you can do. So, as a teacher, one of my most joyful experiences is when my students learn something from me and other people, and they take it in an entirely novel direction that never would have occurred to me. That's great. I love those moments. Some mentors and teachers uh, encounter those moments and feel envious, and that is a hint to you that you've got work to do, right? If you're feeling envious or jealous of something that your mentees are doing, you need to work that out, because it's going to damage your ability to mentor people, right? There might be a bit of narcissism there to look at. So celebrating when the people you're mentoring go beyond you, that's a wonderful thing to be able to do. And then a last skill I'll mention, and we could just go on all day with good mentoring skills, but these are the ones that come to mind as especially important in mentoring the deep stuff to people. So being able to push a little bit, um, in a non-judgmental way, but challenging people a bit. So I was a department chair at a school where one of my faculty and I were both going to do a presentation together. And this particular faculty member didn't feel that she had adequate expertise to do her part of the presentation. I felt that she did. So she kind of waited till the last moment, and then we were sitting together and other people were presenting, and maybe 60 seconds before we were up, she whispers in my ear, I can't do this. I'm not able to do this. So it was a judgment call about whether I should just accept that and just do the presentation myself, which I could. And I said, I want you to do it anyway. I want you to give it a go, right? What's the worst that could happen? You know. So she did a great job, of course. And then afterwards, she thanked me for pushing her a bit. So it's hard to know when sometimes, but I think now and then it's necessary to give people a little bit of a shove in the right direction, intelligently. So, um, so now we've been kind of going funnel fashion with the wider considerations and the context, and then the situation and the skills that are involved. So now we get down to the nub of it. Actual translation of the deep stuff. So first of all, you need to know your audience. You need to know what level of understanding and insight they have so that you can engage them at their level. Wise therapy teachers told me early on in my career that you should be able to have a kind of dual imagining as a therapist, and this applies to mentoring as well, where you have a picture of where you hope the other person will go, but you meet them where they are. And that's all. I think that's very important in terms of not missing. In other words, not going over their head, because that's the usual problem. The problem isn't oversimplifying. Usually, when you're mentoring the deep stuff to people, the problem is going over their head. So you have to cultivate an ability to translate jargon into ordinary terms. Now, when I've taught students this, there's a kind of derogatory term that they often use that I think is part of the problem here. They talk about dumbing it down. It's not dumbing anything down. To be able to talk about complex states of consciousness, for instance, in a clear manner that other people can understand, isn't dumbing anything down. It's intelligent outreach. And I think of an analogy with literature where if you read somebody like, well, if you read Faulkner, that can be difficult. If you read somebody like Steinbeck, I think I was pre-high school when I started reading Steinbeck, and I understood him. And then I go back to him many years later, and I just marvel at how he could say so much in so few and clear words. That's a real teaching gift and a mentoring gift as well. So if you find yourself thinking in terms of dumbing something down, that could use a little inquiry. Like, why are you thinking of it in that terms? In those terms. So being able to translate jargon into understandable language is part of what you will want to practice. And if you think about, so here's a challenge for you. I have your first item to work on. Spiritual seekers of different kinds, and also people who are interested in consciousness studies, will often use what the philosopher Christian de Quincey calls energy talk or energy language. They'll say, well, my vibes are this, or this place has certain energies or vibrations or whatever. So those words mean nothing to people outside your circle. And even inside your circle, they're pretty vague and abstract. So my challenge is find a different way to describe that. When you go into what you call a vortex, maybe you're spending time in Sedona or someplace like that, right? What does that actually feel like? You can get the point across by talking about how your body feels or how your emotions feel or what's happening with your consciousness. So you switch from being abstract to being descriptive, right? When I teach parapsychology, which has to do with those presences of land and place and other things of the earth and how they talk to us, I will use conversational terms like language, communicate, and presence rather than energy talk, right? And you can do even better than that. So being able to have a list of words that you normally use translated into plain language will not only help your mentoring, it'll help your writing too. There's books that are stuffed with all kinds of new age and other jargon out there that nobody but a small group can read. So if you want to broaden your audience, think about that. Another thing, and I think about this, the environmental science students I teach who don't have any background whatsoever in psychology, consciousness studies, or any of that stuff. Their background is ecology and hard science. I do exercises with them. I do guided meditations with them. I help them move their imagination from their mind down through their body into the earth. And those are always rich and moving exercises that we talk about after they do it. So one thing that seems to work pretty well is to give people a task first and then the explanation after. So that's a good way of translating. One of the things that writing fiction is teaching me to do a little bit better, haven't published any yet, but I'm writing a lot of it. And I'm getting it criticized, which you can't learn unless you get critical feedback. So I'll put it in terms of two words: operationalize and dramatize. So operationalize is similar to what we were just saying about practices. When you operationalize something, you break it down into tasks. So have people do the tasks. Don't give them a lot of theory about, let's say, understanding dreams. Actually work on a dream as a series of smaller, manageable tasks, like bringing a dream image back to life, bringing it into the room, imagining it, reimagining it, describing it. That operationalizes things, right? And it also dramatizes. So I've written years of nonfiction. I've published books and papers and so on. And so I know how to explain things to people on paper. But when you write fiction, that's no good. And there's lots of derogatory terms for that, like info dump and stuff like that. And we've all come across that where we're reading a good story and all of a sudden there's this pause and then the author butts in and says, well, in my universe, this is how everything works and this is why this is the way it is, and blah, blah, blah. And it just takes you completely out of the story. So writing coaches will often say you need to dramatize it. You need to put it in the form of a conversation with somebody else or show it somehow. So taking that advice, I think, has helped me be a somewhat better mentor, and I now show people things a lot more and explain things a lot less. Which, by the way, I'm also trying to do in this presentation by giving you a concrete example in limited time. So telling stories that illustrate what you're trying to get across. I began with a quick anecdote about Hillman saying, what is depth, right? Lots of ways you can tell stories, though, even entire stories. Showing films, I sometimes do that when I teach. So making a point with film. There's this film called Ink, to use another specific example, that has this great scene in it that shows how interconnected everything is, which is one of the tropes, one of the truisms of a lot of what I hear in the circles that I teach in and write in. People are always going off about everything's connected and everything talks to everything and blah, blah, blah. It's been said so often it almost doesn't mean anything anymore. And so in this film, there is a scene where a guy named Jacob uh, sets a machine down on the ground. It looks like a little phonograph player, an old-fashioned one, and he cranks it up, and it emits this puff of wind. It's very gentle, and that it causes something to happen, and that causes something to happen, and it just concatenates. It just goes on and on and on, and then it brings about the result that he's hoping for. And so how it plays out and who it influences and the way the music is tick-tocking in the background like a clock all give the feeling of the interconnectedness of things better than an explanation could. So that's one example of how to do this with imagery and film and showing people instead of just telling them. Another suggestion for translating the deep stuff. So I'm going to lean on Sal Minuchin a little, the great South American family therapist who talked about tracking the metaphors of the family. So when you see him work, fortunately, there's some video of him working with families. And he would often take something that was a recurring image in the family, and he would start playing with it to increase the understanding and consciousness of the people in the family itself. But more than that, his play with an image with their image, the images come from the family, would change how family members interact with each other. So I'm thinking of a video I saw where there was a girl on a crutch, and she was kind of the identified patient, to use family therapy language. She's the one that the family would point to and say, she's the problem. And the family therapy teaching is that it's actually the family that's the problem. It's the whole family. So she came in on a crutch and had numerous medical examinations, nothing medically wrong with her leg. And so Minuchin started working the crutch as a symbol, and he had different family members try out the crutch. Like, why don't you pick it up, and how do you use it? What do you look like when you're on a crutch, And he was making the point to the family that the crutch is a family symbol. It's all of you. You're all on the crutch. She's just the one who's identified as having a leg that won't work, So in this video, you can see how it changes the whole process and loosens everything up and teaches family members that they all have a crutch in some ways. And now what do you do, right? What do you do when you're injured and you realize it? Can you tend that somehow without making other people carry it? So he called that tracking the metaphors. So that's a good way of working with people. not necessarily in a therapeutic connection, but just picking up the language that people use and finding ways to creatively mentor them with their own language, with their own images and symbols. So let's see, what else do we have here? Uh, so a couple more things. One, um, look for where people keep their fantasies, their imagination, because that's a gateway into the depths right there. So sometimes we tend to think that, especially those among us who are focused on facts, data, the bottom line, um, give me the practical results. I don't care about the speculation, that kind of thing. We tend to think that those people are not imaginative, and that is not true. Excuse me. Everybody's imaginative. It's a basic characteristic. The trick is to find out where their imagination is. Maybe it's in facts. Maybe it's in money or in bookkeeping or in making lists or whatever it is. An example I've sometimes used, my dad was a guy like that. Bottom line, just give me the practical piece. If it's not practical, get rid of it. And he was a handyman who could make all kinds of things. And that's where his fantasy life was, in making, in creating, right? So if you can find where somebody's imagination lives, then you can form the potentials and the possibilities and whatever you want to teach. You can cast those in imaginative terms that they can understand. So if I was wanting to, let's say I wanted to teach, I never did this, but let's say I wanted to teach my dad a contemplative practice, right? So even if I gave him the science on why contemplative practices are good for you and what they do with your brain and all that, he wouldn't have cared. But if I could have found a way to say, well, did you know that you're already doing one? When you're in your workshop and you're focused for an hour or two on creating something, that is a contemplative practice, right? So then he would have started to be able to relate to it a little bit better, and then we could have taken other steps. So those are some suggestions for translating what you've learned into terms other people can make use of. And the last thing I'll say about this, I'm going to take a little cue from Michael Mead. He's got 2 YouTube videos out there on what he calls mentoring the genius. So he's looking at the old Roman word for a kind of daimon or spirit that hovered around a person and sort of whispered things in your ear about what to do, what not to do, how to live. It's the part of us that's not quite us, that's wiser than us. Today we might call it the higher self or intuition or something like that. So part of what Michael Mead emphasizes is that we need to mentor that too. We need to call on that and have a sense of what somebody's daimon or genius is trying to say to them. So when we do this, of course, we can't teach by rote or mentor by rote. It's not ego-based. What we're trying to mentor in somebody is deeper and wider than their conscious self. So a very concrete example would be, I'm thinking of my birth mother who got some mentoring when she was a girl, a very young girl actually. She was fascinated by music, which is a fascination that runs in the maternal line of my birth families. And she was encouraged at one point to go ahead and start playing the piano. And she became a kind of piano prodigy. So her genius was a musical genius, and it knew that it needed to be nourished, even though nobody could see any practical reason for doing so. So along those lines, and the genius in people, the daimon in people, can point in many different directions. It's not always art and music and stuff like that. To use my dad as an example again, his was artisanship. He was a really great craftsman. So sometimes that's what the genius wants. And I might do, I'm trying to remember if I've already done a video on this, but I might do a video or rather a live stream on personal myths, because that comes into this as well. what's the story behind our story? What's the mythic looking framework, the folkloric framework that we operate in, that we come into? Because that has a lot to do with how to mentor us and what our genius is up to. So I might do that. At my website, I do have a class on personal myth, and I also want to mention I should probably type it into the chat too. If you want more about the topic that we went into today, I've got a video on demand at Vimeo that deals with this topic, the title of it is something like "Teaching to Depth," I think, and I put a link to it also on the page where this video appears, so you'll have that. I'm going to give it another minute for questions. I'm not seeing any so far, but that's what I wanted to present. There's the last thing I'll say while I'm waiting to see if you have any questions. It's so important, I think, to realize that when you learn something that's fairly deep, it brings an obligation along with it to share it with other people. Some of us do it professionally, which I've been doing for a number of years. Even after I leave academic life behind, I think I'll continue to mentor people because of that sense of obligation. Plus, I enjoy it. But I think it's important to actually sit with that, to realize that when we have the privilege to learn these deep kinds of things, we also inherit an obligation to share them with other people, and that's how the world changes for the better. So, Lola, you're asking what was the name of the? He was a writer, but he's also a family therapist. I'll type his name in. It's Salvador Minuchin, Minuchin. I really like his work. When you get trained in family therapy, you're exposed to a number of different ways of working with families, and he was always one of my favorites. Structural family therapy, Sal Minuchin, and partly because he was kind of a trickster with it, and partly because his interventions were so practical and made sense. They didn't have tons of theory behind them, at least at that time, and the theory that there was served the intervention. So I really liked his system. So I think that's going to do it for today. So I will catch up with you on later Fridays, and we'll have different aspects of this work to talk about. Thanks so much.